Good afternoon, YouTube. This will be a study on postmodernism. There's a lot I could talk about this subject because in my school of enrollment, there are a lot of professors that I deem to be ideologically possessed. And it's refreshing to watch Dr. Jordan Peterson because he explains concisely why they're possessed and actually goes back to the source of interpreting texts like the Bible, but it's much more than that. There are several others, Dostoevsky and Jung, for example, that he enjoys to quote and go back to their literature in order to get inspiration. What I'm trying to achieve here is a more in-depth understanding of postmodernism. This is Dr. Stephen Hicks that wrote a book that I guess inspired Jordan Peterson to want to meet him, and this is their correspondence, their conversation. I will intervene once in a while just to add my thoughts, but thank you for watching.
6 issues that come up in postmodernism, the groundwork, so to speak, was laid for that. When I finished grad school, I started teaching full-time, came to Rockford University, teaching in an honors program. And the way that program worked, it was essentially a great books program, so it was like getting a second education wonderfully. But the way it was done was each course was taught by 2 professors to our honor students, and so the professors would be from different departments. So it's paired with literature professors, history professors, and so on. And this is now the middle of the 90s. I started to hear about thinkers I had not read. I kind of heard about them, but now I was reading them more closely and finding that in history and literature and sociology and anthro, names like Derrida and Foucault and the others were, if not omnipresent, were huge names. So I realized I had a gap in my education to fill. So I started reading deeply in them. My education in some ways was broad in the history of philosophy, but narrow at the graduate school level, and I focused mostly on Anglo-American philosophy, so my understanding of the continental traditions was quite limited. But by the time I got to the end of the 90s, I realized there was something significant going on coming out of continental philosophy, and that's where the book came out.
And when you say significant, do you mean, what do you mean by that? Do you mean intellectually? Do you mean socially, politically? There's lots of different variants of significant.
At that point, intellectually, this is still the 1990s, so postmodernism was not yet, outside of, say, art, a cultural force, but it was strongly an intellectual force in that, at that point, young PhDs coming out of sociology, literary criticism, some subdisciplines in the law, if you're getting PhDs in the law, historiography, and so on. And certainly in departments in philosophy still dominated by continental traditional philosophy, that almost all of them are primarily being schooled in what we now call postmodern thinkers. So the leading gurus are people like Derrida, Lyotard, from whom we get the label postmodern condition, Foucault, and the others.
So maybe you could walk us through what you learned, because people are unfamiliar. I mean, you were advanced in your education, including in philosophy, and still recognized your ignorance, say, with regards to postmodern thinking, and so that's obviously a condition that's shared by a very large number of people. And postmodernism is one of those words like existentialism that covers an awful lot of territory, and so maybe we could zero in on exactly what that means and who these thinkers were, Derrida, Foucault, and Lyotard, and what you learned about them.
Okay, yeah, fair enough. Well, all of the thinkers you just named, they think broadly, they think strategically, and they do have a very strong historical perspective on their disciplines, and at the same time they are trying to assess where they think we are culturally, politically, socially. And all of them are making a very dramatic claim that, to some extent, or in some way, modernism has either ended or it has reached its nadir, or all of the kind of the pathologies and negative traits within the modern world are reaching a culmination in their generation. And so it's time for us to both recognize, right, that modernism has come to an end, and that we need some sort of new intellectual framework, a postmodern framework.
Okay, and the modernism that they're criticizing, how would you carry that? That's it. That's Enlightenment values. That's scientific rationalism. How would you characterize it exactly?
Right. All of those would be right elements of it. So, and of course, there are some discipline-specific differences. So, literature people and philosophy people and historians will use modernism slightly differently. But the idea core is that if you look at the pre-modern world, right, essentially the world of the Middle Ages, say, that was itself broken up by a series of revolutions, the Renaissance, Reformation, Counter-Reformation, early scientific revolutions, and all of this is going on in historically short chunks of time, 1500s and 1600s. And so if you look at both the intellectual world and the social world, comparing, say, the 1400s with the 1700s, culturally and intellectually, you're in a different universe, right, at that point. So the features then of the modern world, and now I'm going to use my philosophical labels here, are that we are now naturalistic, right, in our thinking. Right? We're no longer primarily supernaturalistic, right, in our thinking. So we might still be open to the idea that there's a God or some sort of supernatural dimension, right, the way deists are. But first and foremost, we're taking the natural world as a more or less self-contained, self-governing world that operates according to cause and effect, and we're going to study it in its terms. Right? We're not seeing the natural world as a derivative, right, of a higher world, or that everything that happens in the natural world is part of God's plan, and we read omens and so forth into everything. So metaphysically then, right, there's been a revolution, we're naturalistic. Epistemologically, in terms of knowledge, there also has been a revolution. How do we know the important truths? How do we acquire the beliefs that we're fundamentally going to commit our lives to? Well, by the time we become moderns, we take experience seriously, personal experience. We do that more rigorously, and we're developing scientific method, the way of organizing the data. We're taking logic and all of the sophisticated tools of rationality and developing those increasingly. And so our position then is either you know something because you can experience it and verify it right for yourself, or we've done the really hard work of scientific method, and as a result of what comes out of that, that's what we can call knowledge or our best approximation to that.
Okay, so there's something that I want to intervene there. As modernism took hold, it so began the suppression of what I would call the underlying reliance on faith for, well, essentially how to interpret what we are seeing. Professor Hicks talks about how that kind of deriving things from an omen, or we're all acutely aware of, say, our grandparents, or maybe, beyond that, how there are certain cultural quirks that exist for things like good luck, or preventative measures against, say, something negative happening, so you wear a charm, or you conduct yourself in certain ways in certain situations, say a way to respect the dead so as not to upset them. I have Asian background, so I am acutely aware of the practices that were taught to me by my mother, the traditions handed down from generation to generation, to conduct yourself in certain ways, in certain situations, where you show a deep respect for a sacred, or a, say if you're going to we have something like the Day of the Dead in our culture, but it's not exactly like that. It's where the entire family gets together in the cemetery and celebrate and eat. And though I found the situation vastly uncomfortable, everybody is at ease because they seem to be trying to be closer to their ancestors, to those who have died. So, though we have suppressed that in modern education, we gave up something very precious, which is the values, the tradition of the past. And what I'm learning is they use this excuse as a pretense to essentially, when the students come in and are vetted, they are taught to abandon their traditions, their culture, in favor of what Hicks was calling that revolutionary modernism. We only acute what's valuable to us, what we perceive in a scientific perspective, and essentially that's the primary interpretation. Science is the highest level of interpretation. Okay, so I am against that reason because when you're looking only from science, your perspective can become extremely narrow-minded. And I know that's an oversimplification because it is, but when I look at people like my sister, her boyfriend and whatnot, they're constantly looking for something like a higher ideal, because the way that the universities have educated them, they're no longer in touch with like the Christian traditions and values any longer. They stand in ignorance of it, and deliberately so. Not that I'm advocating for that kind of thing, even though I myself, I follow Jordan Peterson in the value of Christianity. But what I'm saying is they're seeking the tools in which they're trying to discover something, like they're trying to create their own value. So my sister, according to her history, has fallen in love with animals. So her ideal value is something like animals. And her boyfriend's ideal is something like science, something like his training. He has a microbiology degree. So he puts the ultimate, they both love animals, but essentially their ultimate ideal is the environment. So great. I look at this, I say it's fantastic. However, they are sort of underlying in the belief that the human race is secondary to the environment. Okay? So when you look at it from the analysis, what the universities are doing is they're emptying out the traditions of the past. They're actually in spite of them. And I've seen in many of my lectures where, they talk about Christ as though he was a historical, studyable figure. And they never go into the words of Christ, let's say, and the in-depth meaning. They analyze Christ as a person. So they say, oh, he's a criminal like this. Like I hear something like a very superficial analysis, just so that they can essentially undermine Christianity itself as a religion, and that faith has no value. Faith itself is being attacked in every way, and that characteristic cannot no longer exist in contemporary human beings. So after they've gotten rid of that, because they will teach you what they call critical thinking, which is essentially their form of brainwashing, because their perspective of critical thinking, there can be no other lines of inquiry, let's say. So if you want to remain Christian and you say, I have my faith, well, they'll put you down because they say you'll never be an intellectual because you have faith. Because scientific method dictates that things cannot be existing under the pretense of faith, and that everything has to be explained scientifically one way or another, and there's no other inquiries beside that. So what Jordan Peterson found out, or what he was trying to nail, is that kind of oppressive of mentality designed to muscle you into abandoning the traditions of the past, into abandoning your faith, which, as he's pointed out in many lectures, the spiritual element of a human being is not something tangible, yet ever present. And it's not something that you can readily ignore. And then in other lectures, he was trying to explain how you can possibly narrow down the proof of this. So, but in our religions, they teach you that everything is not explicit. It's not something that, you know, reality itself cannot just be narrowed down to what you can see, what you can touch, what you can explain. There are things greater than human beings. A fundamental truth that existed when I was young, about 30 years ago, but now has essentially been destroyed. I look at how anti-Christian sentiment spread through Montreal. There was a movement to destroy the church in Montreal. Pierre Trudeau was one of the perpetrators. But there were about, I think, 10 people that really, politicians and whatnot, that really destroyed it. And today, the churches essentially have been vacant buildings available for rent, or for like a hall or something to celebrate a birthday or whatever. But what I was told is that there was a abandonment of Christianity and then a massive increase in sexual power, prostitution, advertising, sex, and whatnot in Montreal. A massive movement. So I'm trying to bring that in for context, because I'm sort of trying to figure out how this happened. So what I think was that PETERSON was right, that after they had destroyed tradition, the ultimate ideal of God himself, or the idea of faith, that they were trying to figure out a new value for human beings. And as I can see it, that new value is environmentalism and environmental radicalism. I talked with my friend's daughter the other day, and she seems to be happy that COVID is keeping people in because the environment is benefiting. There's less pollution and whatnot. And I'm sure there are some among people out there that probably feel the same way. What I did is I concisely explained to her, okay, carbon emissions are the reason why this house is heated. Okay. Pardon me, petroleum. And this house is heated by natural gas, for example. So when you look at our society, you look at something as essential as heating house. If it's cold, do you still feel like... I'm sorry, this video is getting too long already. I have to cut it right there.